Hey everyone, welcome to another Intro to Java programming video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the JOptionPain to get user input. I'm going to run this so that you can understand what user input is all about. And it brings up this thing here. It's like a pop-up box. It's called a JOptionPain. And JOptionPain has an icon, it's got a label, it's got a text field, and it's got some buttons by default. It's got an OK and a cancel button. And I'm going to enter an int, 100, click OK. And you can see that the value 100 is drawn right there on my JFrame. So what's happening there is that JOptionPain is taking data in from my keyboard and bringing it into the computer, into the program. That's called an input. And an input is any kind of external device that's bringing data into the computer. So I'm using it for user input. Let's take a look at the code. So I've got some variables here. Variables are like a box that stores data. And I've got 3 integer variables, num1, num2, and sum. I've got a string called input and a JLabel called output. I have my main method, and in my main, I'm doing all the stuff to get my JFrame going. I instantiate my JFrame right here. I set the size on the JFrame. I call on a method called createGUI, which I'm going to create, and then I call on setVisible to true. So let's take a look at createGUI. CreateGUI is a new method that I am creating, and when I invoke it, it's going to execute everything inside of here. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the layout to a flow layout. Basically what that does, it takes all the components that I put into my JFrame and puts them side by side by side. I'm going to set default close operation exit on close, and I'm going to get something called the content pane, and I'm going to call it window. And then I've got a variable called output, and it is a JLabel, and it just says output on it right now. And then I'm going to add the output variable to the window. So that's going to put it on there so that when the JFrame opens, it comes up with that label on it. Next thing that's going to happen, I'm going to call on this method here called showInputDialog from the JOptionPain class. JOptionPain.showInputDialog is going to create that pop-up box and make it show up on screen. And it's going to take in 2 arguments. One argument is the observer, and if you just pass window into it, that means that the JFrame itself is where that JOptionPain is going to pop up. And then the string is right here, and that's going to be the label that shows up on there. So when I run this, it's going to pop up right in the center because that's where the JFrame would show up. And I'm going to type in a value, hello. And that's not an int, but whatever. That's going to give me a problem, and I'll talk about that problem in a little bit. But let me do this again. Pass in an int, 100, click OK. And you can see that it takes that value and puts it here. So let's run this again. Now you can see that this string right here, please enter an int, corresponds with this label right there on the JOptionPain, on the input dialog. Whatever I put in here is what's going to show up on that JOptionPain. Okay? And it has the ability to take in 1 value. Let's take a look at the next thing. I've got this step right here. Integer.parseInt, and I pass input into it. This is really, really important because on this project this week, you're going to be taking in a series of numbers using that showInputDialog. And the showInputDialog takes them in as type string. String is not compatible with integers. In other words, strings cannot make calculations. I can't take a string. Even if it's a number, 100, it's still considered 3 separate characters, and we can't do calculations of those. So we have to change those strings into numbers. So I pass input into this parseInt method in the integer class, and it's going to return an int representation of whatever was in that string. if there is a number value with that string. So if I pass 250 into it, what's going to happen is that 250 is going to come into input. It's going to get passed into this method, and it's going to parse that 250 into an integer and store it here. But what if it's not an integer? What if we pass something into it that's not a number? Like hello, spelled incorrectly. We get a problem. We're going to get something called a type mismatch. It's going to say Java lang number format exception. What's happening here is this parse int is expecting a string that has a number in it. Hello, with only one L, didn't have a number in it, so parse int didn't know what to do with it. So you get that error. That's one of those errors that comes up when you use the parse int method. Okay, so if you pass a value in there correctly, like if I pass in a string that could be represented as a number, like 1000, it works. Okay, so that's what the parse int does. You're going to use these two things in conjunction with one another to take in inputs from the user on the next project. Now lastly, our output. This is setting that input value to our output. So output is our JLabel. And the JLabel gets added to the content pane and shows up on the screen. And it has to take in some sort of a string. Okay? If I did something like this, and run this, you're going to see that that label will say, I am a label. No matter what I put in here. It just says, I am a label. So it expects some sort of a string. If I put input into here, it's going to take whatever was put into input and put it on that label. Okay? Well, now let's see what happens when I put num1 into here. It's going to say we've got an error. setText in the JLabel class is looking for a string, not an int. So I've got to make sure I put the string into it, not into the int. Now there are a couple ways of fixing it. I could do this, and what's happening there is it's basically changing this into a string by concatenating it with an empty string. And there's also a method called valueOf that allows me to create a string from an integer. But what we're going to do for now is just pass input into it, and it's all going to work just fine. Okay? So that is your introduction to the input dialogues.